Welcome to Awakening Somatic Intelligence, dialogues on the science, art, and practice of embodied mindfulness with your host, Dr. Risa Kaparo, author, psychotherapist, minister, master yoga teacher, dancer, poet, and songwriter, and the developer of somatic learning. As a young adult, Dr. Risa Kaparo successfully healed herself from a painful and life-threatening illness. The discoveries she made led her to create a methodology to transform pain, stress, trauma, and aging, and promote wellness, embodied mindfulness, and vital longevity. This system, called somatic learning, is based on a synthesis of psychological, somatic, and meditative disciplines, having been developed during 35 years of research, clinical practice, and training of healthcare practitioners, as well as yoga and meditation teachers. Her new book, Awakening Somatic Intelligence, The Art and Practice of Embodied Mindfulness, and its companion DVDs and CDs, capture the wisdom of her teachings. A licensed psychotherapist and somatic learning facilitator, Dr. Kaparo practices in the San Francisco Bay Area and by Skype, offering her unique approach to self-healing to thousands of individuals around the world. She has taught somatic learning and co-presencing, her form of dialogue work, at many institutions internationally, including MIT, JFK universities, and China's Dalian Medical University. An award-winning poet and songwriter with 2 CDs of poetry and music, Awaken and Grateful, and Embrace, a book of poems, Dr. Risa Kaparo will intrigue, entertain, and inspire you to engage the power of your own self-awakening.
I am delighted to be here today with Thomas Hüble, and we're talking about embodiment and social meditation. And Thomas is a spiritual teacher of great vision and clarity who sees the possibility of human evolution as a response to the upheavals of our time. And he developed something I believe called the Academy of Inner Sciences as one of the expressions of bringing his vision into the world. Thank you for sharing this dialogue together.
Thank you.
So I'm very interested in this dispelling a kind of misidentification that we have between what I call image-object bound experience, like how you look to me, you know, at a few feet away, or if I looked in a mirror, how I look to myself. And the assumption that here at no distance the same thing is taking place as what appears to me at a distance. That kind of inferential way of knowing myself, which appears somewhat object-like or continuous over time, relatively fixed,
Right.
yeah, and separate.
Right.
And so my work has been very much an exploration of a different quality of innate intelligence, which I refer to as somatic intelligence. And I use that term because in English we don't really have an appropriate term. Somatic referring to how life senses itself and that kind of bubbling, bursting, blooming forth of consciousness in the here and now. So it's very much an inside-out way of sensing, feeling, knowing, versus a kind of outside-in way of relating to what's taking place here. And,
Right.
And I think that because the body, the self, even the world, live in experience, not the other way around as we commonly take it, that inversion from an inferential way of knowing through images and a self-sensing awareness is like, well, it's an inversion that's not unlike like a Copernican revolution in consciousness. I mean, it really reveals to us how just even the smallest shift in awareness can reflect itself so that we're not living in the same body or even the same universe.
Yes.
And the practice is about living in the engagement of that innate intelligence.
Mm-hmm. So to transform that indirect experience into a direct experience.
Yes.
In a way.
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I know that you talk about practice a lot too, and being able to practice in the world and developing a new culture of we that isn't based on identification with this, separate sense of self, but a sense of connection to all that is arising in this moment. That for me is also a reflection of this, how we know how life senses itself in this deep underlying connectedness somatically.
Right.
And I wonder if you'd talk about your sense of practice in that way.
Right. Mm-hmm. Where to start? So the first thing is that I think in the current level of human evolution, we are very much in the state of consciousness that you described, that I see an image of reality within my bubble of experience.
Yeah.
And I interpret this image with my cognition. So basically I'm constantly in the indirectness of life. Because I see you arising in my reality, and then there's an interpretation. So, and then I'm separate from you. But through the spiritual practice, we can practice to live to transcend this level of cognition into higher levels of cognition or experience or perception, or how they are all going together, level by level. And I think that what you suggest is a way how to transcend the separate form of experience into a kind of a directness. And the body and the inner experience of the body is the beginning of realizing this deep connectedness to all that there is. Yes, and at the same time, when we are in this kind of more direct experience of connectedness, we are still in a level of connectedness. So if I'm connected to the world, or if I'm more connected to something, I'm still connected to.
Well, or the intrinsic connectedness of not two being related, but as one reflected in different ways of different expressions, right, of that wholeness.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I think some people that hear connectedness might relate this to an experience of I feel connected to you.
Yeah.
You know? And then it keeps still this level of duality that there are two and they meet. And on one level of life this is also true. But there's a deeper level of realization to this. And I think it's very important to not to understand it that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and the work that I do, the body is a central portal. It's very much about receiving the gift of our embodiment, because it's such a finely tuned feedback system that, like any feedback system, it potentiates our learning. And just like you wouldn't learn to swim without water, you need like the feedback real time of the pressure of that substance to feel how you're propelling yourself through this medium, that the quality of being able to sense, and not the body as object, but the body in the sense of the unfolding of intelligence into form and the unfolding into the undifferentiated wholeness at the same time.
Right.
Right. And so it becomes a portal that
Right.
people have
Right.
immediate access to.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then the deep mystical knowledge of like higher levels of consciousness that we can embody, not just realize. And then it's very important actually for the spirituality on the market, or in the marketplace. It's very important that we learn about the principles of embodiment. So when we have a higher realization,
Yes.
so we break through the ceiling of our consciousness.
Yes.
So the realization is one thing, but the embodiment and really bringing it all the way down through our somatic experience is actually creating a new reality within myself, my own experience, and then also in the moment this happens, everybody who is in my experience is part of it. So it uplifts the whole context.
Yes.
And that's very beautiful. And the mystical, the true mystical traditions talked about this already 5,000 years ago.
Yes.
You know, about the process of how energy incarnates and how higher realizations incarnate.
Yeah.
Because I think that this piece that you said, we have access to the body, is very, it's such a simple thing, but it's such an important part, because many people have insights, but then their life is actually a split. So they actually can either go to a group or have it with some friends, but then there is work. And in my work, it's not like this, you know, or in my intimate relationship, it's not like this.
Yes.
So I experience somewhere in my life, I experience this higher consciousness, or this more presence and more clarity, but actually not everywhere. And it's a sign that it didn't fully embody yet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The way I use the term shame as an affect, and just to share in a similar way of talking about, I'm using affect to refer to a biological response.
Right.
That when it becomes conscious, we call feeling, right? And when it becomes interwoven with our sense of biography or story that we're identified with, then we call it emotion, right? But just this biological response that happens. And shame as an affect is this sensing of losing connection to what was sustaining us in riding the waves of joy and interest, which is when we're most coherent, really, in those states. And I think one way to think about that is that we have a tuning system. It's like fine-tuning the needles on like a compass or something, so that we can navigate our experience better. And I think about the ancient navigators, you know, the wayfarers that migrated from the Marquesa Islands to the Hawaiian Islands, where I lived for many years. About 1,800 years ago, they went on these dugout canoes all the way across the Pacific Ocean. They were going to these islands that were surrounded by over 2,000 miles of sea in all directions.
Right.
And how did they do that? Because they obviously had no navigational equipment, and many times the stars were covered by storms. And it turned out that these navigators actually learned to use the vessel of their own bodies, the most sensitive parts of their bodies, to be able to feel the slipstream that actually could carry them the distance across the whole Pacific, right?
Right.
But it's a deep current and it's narrow, and so not to lose connection, which would be death for them, right? They learn to rest their testicles on the base of the canoe, you know, so that as soon as they lose connection to that which was sustaining them, right, they'd feel that change in pressure.
Right.
And so I think of that as kind of what shame is like in our system, you know, that it's like an indication, like our needle starts to move, that, ooh, we lost connection to what was, you know, that sense of what's sustaining us in this downstream motion in a way, right?
And that is a beautiful way how to attune our lives more and more from this separateness to a connectedness and then to a non-duality, so that we really learn that feeling. Many people, when they hear feeling, they think, oh, we feel emotions. But no, feeling is a very, very precise tool to become aware of the body of life, but the big body of life. So this means that what we are working with very much is that the feeling awareness, that actually every developmental stage of our development is a layer of information that we can perceive. So perception can be fine-tuned so that every human being radiates the whole information, whole past, the whole future, into this now. And when I'm open enough and skilled enough, what I call spiritual competency, then all the information can be read like a book. And for this I need my body. I need to be embodied in order to really navigate in the system of life. Because this is my connection unit to the system of life. But that there's a very precise and refined inner science, I believe, that from the levels of development we know, and the levels of development that are still very far out for most of the people, so that all of this is actually within our capacity to feel. And feeling emotions or feeling body energies is just one part of it. And many people relate feeling, it's a bit cheap, oh, it's just my feelings, you know, but that actually every level of development can be precisely addressed by my feeling awareness and my presence. So when we communicate with people, we immediately see which areas they are living in their bodies, and which areas they don't, which areas are conscious and which areas are unconscious. You know, with which level of their awareness they can listen, and when they cannot listen anymore, or when they don't want to listen anymore inside. So these are very fine, these are just very simple examples, but they are very fine details. And so I liked your compass needle because it's actually a really refined scientific process in a way.
A fine-tuning, of perception. That
it's not a random thing, okay, I feel it or I don't. There is a science of feeling behind. You know, and that people that are very refined and clear in a way, they come very quickly to the same results in a way.
And I think that the foundational to that, like, I like to make this distinction between, okay, the self-2, which is like if you think of self-1, just to have shared terminology as the acting, thinking, you know, feeling self, and self-2, the one that's reflecting over that self, right? But in time. Like, you know, like reading, like you were describing, you know, like your life, and trying to act on, which is a kind of mode of self-management or self-control, trying to improve what self-one is doing, you know? And this other intelligence that was referring to as somatic intelligence is an intelligence that is self-sensing and self-organizing, and of course self-renewing, right? And it's living in the now, in the emerging. It's how life is sensing itself as it's emerging, and in always on the edge of living into the unknown and embodying it more fully, right? And that process is has those characteristics of intelligence that is not trying, doesn't require a secondary active will. It's not trying to fix, you know, the self, but it is able to reorganize and self-correct and shape-shift, and like just by really loving what it loves and savoring what's emerging now with the sense of I loved the other day listening to you speak about the hand and the sense of giving. And for me, the practice is so much about sort of receiving the gift of the infinite that's always present by savoring, drinking in what's here now. And in the drinking in, there's this kissing back to all of that, that is just natural, that is actually enhancing the joy of just tasting the moment, you know, kind of leaning into what you love. And so that process by which we participate in a way that is emerging out of that lovingness, and in a way that is always sort of enhancing or leaning us into the joy of receiving the gift of being embodying the infinite so intimately, you know, in terms of the felt sense of experience in this moment.
Right.
Yeah.
And that this is in synchronicity with the higher, now it's very modern to call it evolutionary or creative impulse of the universe.
Yeah.
Because this intelligence is unfolding through us.
Yes.
Like the tree that's growing a leaf and then it becomes a small branch, and then so the universe expresses itself through us, and this is, once we can live out of this moving energy that where evolution carries the intelligence forward in higher complexities, then we are living actually in alignment with life. And that's a very different life than when we live in the separate experience of life.
Yes.
Because it creates much less side effects.
And so effortless, just like the plant that is just yearning for the light, you know. Its growth isn't like, it's not trying to grow, right? It's just loving what it loves into, you know, being in its true nature, an expression of what's emerging.
Right. And it needs this listening, because there's a certain stage in the development that we need to learn to listen to this more than to the conditioned self. And that most of the people's attention is fixed on the conditioned self, so it needs a spiritual practice or some kind of, however we call it, practice to listen more to this bigger existence. Like the fluid of the tree that supports the leaf to grow. So to listen to this fluid. But by listening to this fluid, we also see that we are never separate from the rest. You know, that the ego experience that is separate is actually transcended into a knowing that it's not separate, not just a logical idea. You know, the rational understanding of we are not separate, but it becomes a living
felt sense
fact.
Yes.
And then it supports this movement very much, that we see that when the hands open, this fluid is actually our abundance. So there's no shortage of this creative impulse.
I loved your referring to us as growing this, I think you describe it as a culture of we.
Right. A we without them.
We without them. I loved your referring to us as growing this, I think you describe it as a culture of we.
Right. A we without them.
We without. People come to me because they're in pain, either from psychological trauma or often from physical injury or the effects of aging or illness. And the beauty of that is that this necessity, you know, raises a sense of urgency. And I think my teacher often said that people would have the energy it needed to wake up if they saw their lives burning.
That's
and
beautiful.
Krishnamurti, he had he used to like to tell sometimes the stories when he was trying to wake people up about during the wars, you know, how he'd hear of these hospitals that were bombed and how, you know, people who hadn't been out of a bed for sometimes years, seeing the flames erupt all around them, somehow had whatever it took to just thrust themselves out the window to save their lives, you know, and no one can quite explain it. And so he'd say, well, if you saw your life burning, now you'd have the energy, right?
Right.
And my sense is that that's true, and that's necessary but insufficient, because people often respond to that from this fight, flight, you know, kind of response.
Right.
So they can't respond to the urgency on the same order of sort of thought that the problem arose from, right? And so somehow it has to turn to gravity inside of them. You know, the urgency is necessary, and something needs to, they need to somehow, instead of bracing against the experience or the pain and trying to fix it, to actually begin to feel what happens when they embrace what's arising and open to the spaciousness that comes as they open to this, to the now. And the gift in all of that is that the same thing that is required for the system to reorganize itself and renew itself, that quality of embracing the spaciousness and that lighting up is what's needed, you know, to heal them, is also what awakens them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This letting, like you were describing earlier, letting something almost sink. I think of it as like landing like a bird into its shadow and fitting completely, you know, that deep sense of embodiment. So helpful to have dialogue as a form of kind of social meditation, because it's as if we can see through, you know, many kind of windows into consciousness, and the possibility for thought itself to become proprioceptive, self-sensing, and self-correcting, self-organizing, self-renewing, updating itself. Because what it reveals to us then is the incoherencies that are inherent in the system of thought, not even in your thought or my thought, you know, that there's an attribution that there is a your thought or my thought. Right. And so this, for us to be able to see together, to develop a more self-sensing movement of thought, less habituated by these, you know, the infrastructure of our thoughts, images and
that's beautiful.
Identification. Yeah.
And therefore the communication is so important, because this we can give each other the abilities of our eyes, of our presence, of our hearts, and we can let them join, and then the probability is much higher that the shadow that cannot be seen by me can be seen by you, and I can actually borrow your eyes in a way to get the reflection that I cannot give to myself.
Yes. And the beauty is that we stop making the attributions in a way of about me. There's just the seeing.
There's a seeing. Life sees itself.
And so it's so much easier not to get caught in the shame loops, you know, of and needing to protect and defend and uphold the sense of self, as if like I had to defend against your sense of rightness, you know, intruding, or your authority. But there's just the willingness to kind of dive deeper into the river just for the joy of sharing the inquiry. And so I'll take this off if it's in the way, I'll take that off, you know, and just the pleasure of seeing together.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, fun.
Thank you.
da